2 weeks ago marked the beginning of yet another school year for me. That was when all the 200-day employees, assistant principals, guidance counselors, and academic coaches, that would be me, were scheduled to return to our school building. My new position does not require me to be, as teachers often say, in the trenches, meaning that rather than being in the classroom each day with students, my job places me on the sidelines, coaching teachers to provide the best possible instruction in literacy and writing. But as I prepared for the start of a new school year, I did plan to start the new year in the trenches. Last year, as one of my American literature teachers let me know that his wife was expecting their first child in mid-July. So when school began, he would be taking some paternity leave. Because American literature is currently the only high school English course to which the state of Georgia attaches the state standardized test, I volunteered to step in and provide instruction in his absence, which I assumed would be 2, maybe 3 weeks. Being steeped in American culture, the only developed nation in which women are hardly given time after adopting or giving birth to bond with their baby before they're forced to return to work, and in which men are expected to return to work immediately after becoming a father, this was a natural assumption for me. We'd be back in 2, maybe 3 weeks. But when I received an email from this teacher notifying me of the arrival of their baby and that he would return to work possibly in late October, I remembered something about this teacher. He's Canadian. He's from a country where they actually allow new mothers and fathers both at least 15 weeks of paid leave and up to 35 weeks for one of the new parents. As I began to wrap my head around the reality that I would have to fulfill my duties coaching teachers from the sidelines while also being in the trenches, I admit I panicked a little. But at the same time, I was a little excited as I thought of lessons I would be teaching during the 3 months of my Canadian teacher's paternity leave. One of the lessons I most look forward to is one that I've taught many times throughout the year, a lesson in which I teach imagery and rhetorical appeals through a dramatic reading of Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Your damnation does not slumber. It will come swiftly, and in all probability very suddenly upon many of you. You have reason to wonder that you are not already in hell. Therefore, let everyone that is out of Christ now await. The wrath to come. The wrath of Almighty God is now undoubtedly hanging over a great part of this congregation. Let everyone cry out, Sodom. Escape for your life. Look not behind you. Escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed.
As you can see, I enjoy transforming my classroom into 18th century church, and for one day each year, pretending to be a fire and brimstone Puritan minister. It's fun because it is just that, pretend, make-believe, an imaginary trip back in time. That is what any sermon such as this should be, a relic of a bygone time. The concept of a fearful God who looks down upon humanity in wrath, holding us over the fires of hell as a spider over a flame, should be one that theologians and religious institutions have rejected as our theology has evolved. And in many ways, that has happened. It would be hard-pressed to find a minister in even the most conservative denominations who's ever preached a message as blunt as Edwards. Whereas Edwards preached the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors or hates you. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. Today, most churches and ministers prefer the message that God, although he may hate sin, loves the sinner. Whereas Edwards warned sinners to flee the wrath of God, the modern evangelical preaches that God stands at the doorway calling, "O sinner, come home." But no matter how you spin it, if your sermon ends with God throwing people into a fire for all eternity, you are not preaching about a loving or merciful God. The two ideas are simply incompatible. When I left the religious tradition in which I was raised, one of the first things I dropped from my theology was hell. This particular theological shift seemed to be instantaneous and unforced. I never looked back at the scriptures and determined that I had misinterpreted references to eternal punishment. I just didn't believe in hell any longer. It wasn't something that I thought a great deal about. I just sort of realized it. It wasn't so much a matter of concluding that there was no hell, as much as it was a matter of acknowledging to myself that I did not believe such a place could exist. I find it surprising that I was so readily willing and able to cast my belief in hell aside. Not that there was any reason to cling to it, but simply because it was so ingrained in me. I was raised on hellfire and brimstone preaching. I was raised in a church where at least once a week during a revival, the minister preached that every one of us were on our way to hell. I was raised they passed around this book that was published called, I didn't write this down, I'm reading this part. A Divine Revelation of Hell. I remember reading that book as a teenager in bed, and it's scaring the literal hell, the figurative hell, out of me. It was that terrible. I was raised on hell. Those that preach the fires of hell will argue that God's justice necessitates eternal damnation. The website, the Gospel Coalition, contains an article entitled 12 Questions for the Would-Be Universalist. In it, the author writes, God's justice requires one or the other, either the hell of Jesus' agony, in which the sinner's guilt is vicariously atoned for, or the hell of individual suffering for the one who rejects Jesus and his atoning work. While the Christian Universalists would argue that Jesus' agony was sufficient to atone for the sins of the world without the need for personal acceptance, and Universalists who are not necessarily Christian would argue that God's justice requires neither sacrificial nor personal suffering, I have at times wondered if maybe there's something to the idea of there being justice in a hell. As much as I reject the idea of a loving God creating an eternal torture chamber, I must admit that at times universalism may leave us feeling that the universe is unjust. When we think of some of the most vile and evil people who have ever lived, those who seemingly lack any conscience, empathy, or regard for other human lives, the idea of eternal damnation feels like justice, especially if they died without ever facing justice in this life. If there is no hell, does that mean that men like Hitler, Osama bin Laden, Christopher Columbus never faced justice for their unspeakable crimes? They just get a holiday, or at least one of them, and that's all? Even more perplexing, if there is a heaven, how do we as Universalists justify sharing heaven with such vile, monstrous human beings? I pose this as a question to which I do not currently have an answer. And though I do not know the answer to this question, I will say hell is not the answer. To those who argue that universalism fails to provide justice that can only come through eternal punishment for the wicked, I would ask, what happens if evil men like Hitler uttered a prayer for forgiveness just before their death? Where is the justice in avoiding punishment through a moment of faith? Moreover, a component of justice is that the punishment must fit the crime. To sentence a person to be tormented for all eternity is cruel and unusual punishment for even a lifetime of the most vile sin. When it comes to questions of justice being achieved after this life, there are no easy answers. And not only is that okay, I am glad for it. As Universalists, our rejection of eternal damnation causes us to not look for justice on either streets of gold or in the flames of hell. Justice is not a system of rewards and punishments in the afterlife. Justice is for this life. Justice is the ongoing pursuit of fairness, equity, and compassion in all aspects of human interaction and societal structures. Justice is rooted in the principles of love, respect, and the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and it calls for collective efforts to dismantle oppression, promote inclusivity, and create a society that reflects these values. For far too long, the notion that justice is achieved in the afterlife has been used to promote or at least condone injustice in this life. If you're poor on earth, don't worry. You'll walk on streets of gold in heaven. If you're enslaved in this life, you'll have freedom in the next life. Those who exploit and oppress the unhoused, the refugee, They may get away with it in this world, but they'll face judgment and eternal punishment in another world. Those who espouse a theology of hell may call this justice, but as universalists, we say justice delayed too long is justice denied. To hell with waiting for justice in the next life, give us justice in this world. In an article by Reverend Anthony Maker, he tells a story of the famous Universalist minister, Hosea Ballou. The story goes, as he and a Baptist colleague were out circuit riding, he and his Baptist friend began to argue over the issue of eternal damnation. The Baptist minister asserted, if I were a Universalist and feared not the fires of hell, I could hit you over the head, steal your horse and saddle and ride away. I'd still go to heaven. Ballou answered, if you were a Universalist, the idea would never occur to you. Ballou was an adamant preacher of universalism, so much so that he was called an ultra-universalist. His passion for universalism was so great, not because of its effect on the afterlife, but because he understood that what we believed about the afterlife affected how we live in this life. He wrote, it is well known that the human heart is capable of becoming soft or hard, kind or unkind, merciful or unmerciful, by education and habit. On this principle, we contend that the infernal torments, or hell, which false religion has placed in the future world, and which ministers have, with an overflowing zeal so constantly held up to the people, have tended to harden the hearts of the proponents of this religion, that they have exercised toward their fellow creatures a spirit of enmity, which but too well corresponds with the relentless cruelty of their doctrine. By having such an example constantly before their eyes, they have become so transformed into its image that whenever they have had the power, they have actually executed a vengeance on men and women, which evinced that the cruelty of their doctrine had overcome the native kindness and compassion of the human heart. It seems that once, when Ballou was out circuit riding, he stopped for the night at a New England farmhouse. Over dinner, Ballou learned that the family's eldest son was something of a ne'er-do-well. He rarely helped out with chores or did any work on the farm. He stole money from his parents. He spent it whenever he went out late at night partying and carousing at the local tavern. The family was afraid that their son was going to hell. All right, Ballou told them, I have a plan. We'll find a spot on the road where your son walks home drunk at night. We'll build a big bonfire, and when he passes by, we'll grab him and throw him into the fire. The young man's parents were aghast. That's our son, and we love him, they said to Ballou. Ballou responded, if you, human and imperfect parents, love your son so much that you wouldn't throw him into the fire, then how can you possibly believe that God, the perfect parent, would do so? Espousing or preaching eternal damnation has consequences, not in a fictional location one goes to in the afterlife, but consequences right here on earth. Like the parents in the story, we would never imagine inflicting such cruel punishment as hell on those we love. And so when we are taught that God punishes some that way, we're forced to see them as others, the saved and the damned, the sheep and the goats, the saved and the lost. I ask my students every year to consider the significance of Jonathan Edwards' use of second-person point of view in his sermon. That world of misery, the lake of burning brimstone, is extended abroad under you, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you. You have offended him, O sinner. You hang by a slender thread with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it. Rather than speaking in the first person plural, he excludes himself, setting himself apart as righteous and separating him from the vile sinners to whom he preaches. Edwards does this because his goal is to incite fear. But our calling is not to scare the hell out of the world. Our calling is to love the hell out of the world. Amen. And may it be so.